Make a vintage pattern, they said. It's just a skirt pattern, it'll be fun, they said. What's the worst that could happen, they said. Really? 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 All jokes aside, the Patreon peeps did vote for this Halston McCalls 5829 sewing pattern to be the next project that I tackled. Now, up until this skirt, I have made a grand total of 1 vintage sewing pattern, and I ended up with a piece left over. You know, like when you make IKEA furniture and there's always that extra screw? I ended up with the facing left over. I could not work out how that thing was meant to go in, so I didn't include it. It's in a drawer somewhere and I just finished off the neck edge with bias binding. You know what? It's totally fine and it worked. But yeah, I am not an aficionado of vintage sewing patterns, and they are very, very different. They're single size for a start. This one was not my size. Thankfully, this one was printed, and actually, you know what? It was really, really well designed and really, really well thought out, and actually went together surprisingly easily once I'd worked out what I was doing. But before I could get to the sewing, before I could get to the cutting out, before I could get to even muzzling, oh, words are hard, before I could get to even toiling, there we go, before I could get to even toiling this skirt, I needed to make it fit me. Now, it had a 26.5-inch waist. Did it? It did. It had a 26.5-inch waist. My waist currently is 28 inches. So I knew I was going to have to grade that up. But the hips on this thing were 41 inches. Mine are 43 on a good day. And with this kind of a skirt, you definitely want some wearing ease so that you can move and go about your daily life. So I knew some alterations needed to be made. The pattern pieces look like this. Now, in fact, the front and the back skirt pattern piece are exactly the same, but the notches that are in the same place are numbered differently, and that is the trick to getting this thing to go together easily. So I knew that whatever alterations I did to one side, I was going to have to do to the other side, and this is the process I went through to get this skirt to fit. Welcome to the upside down drawing section of today's video. I have a blown up picture of the pattern pieces that feature on the sewing instructions. These ones here. So I've taken a photo of it, blown it up, because trying to demonstrate this full size would be really difficult. I also want to say, again, I am not an expert and I'm making this up as I go along. I have no idea if this is the correct way of doing this or not, but it's the way that I did it, and I got an decent result, and I think the plan I have for this skirt in the future to make a version of this from my block is going to give me an even better result. So I have traced out pattern piece 1 and 2. They are identical, but they do have notches on them that are numbered, and those different notches correspond to different pieces, and that's how you work out how to put this skirt together, because this is the waistline here, this is supposed to be the center front and the center back, and then obviously this is the hem of the skirt, and then obviously waistline, center back, center front, and those pieces go together. So I've drawn in the seam allowance, and I'm going to go a little bit closer. So I've drawn in the seam allowance on both of these pieces because the way I ended up doing it, I needed both of these pieces. First thing I did was measure the circumference of the waist with the seam allowance in. Then I measured my hip measurement, which ended up being about 10 inches down the fullest part of my hips, and I drew that line. I measured down and I drew that line in on both pattern pieces, and then measured that line, and that one came out to 40 inches, and I have a hip measurement of 43, and I want some ease in this particular part of the skirt as well, so I decided to go for a finished garment measurement of 44 inches. So the first thing that came to mind was slash and spread. That's what I've done in the past. So I drew a line from the center of the waist down like this, and I did it for both pieces because, again, you need to do the same alteration to both pattern pieces to get it to work. So I drew a line down there, and then I did the slash and spread method. So I clipped up to the seam allowance but not through it, and then all the way up through the line that I'd drawn. So I think I said I wanted to go for a 44-inch finished measurement, which meant that I needed to add 2 inches to each pattern piece because I want, at the moment it's 40 and I want it to be 44. So on a scrap piece of paper, it's always fun doing this in miniature, on a scrap piece of paper I drew a line 2 inches apart, and obviously this is, I'm just it's not quite to scale. I'm kind of making this up. Okay, so I took my first pattern piece, and at the line where I've marked my hips, I took the first pattern piece and spread so that it was meeting up with the 2-inch mark, and taped it down. So I then spread this to make sure that the hip line is hitting the other side of the 2-inch mark that I've made, and taped that down. Now, as you can see, I have created a giant wedge of fullness here, and I have also really messed with this straight line. So what I did next was even out that straight line and make sure to just move across the markings, because they are important. I'm going to do exactly the same for the other piece. So I'm going to get that done and then I'll come back. Okay, so as you can see, I have ended up trimming off quite a large chunk of each pattern, but that's fine. We don't need that anymore, so that can go. And I have also greatly increased the length of this whole seam here. So if I try to sew notches number 2 to notches number 2, they're actually not going to fit together. The hem's going to be good, but this piece here where we need to pivot is massively out of whack. And then if we bring it back so that the pieces will actually fit together at the pivot point, the hem's massively out of whack. So the first thing I thought was, oh, okay, I'll just add to the hem the whole way around. But as you can see, it's not quite like a proper circle, so I didn't want to mess with the hemline too much, because it's not just like, oh, just increase the entire hemline the whole way around. Because if you did that, then you'd make this part even longer as well, which is not what you want. So it would have to have been kind of like, leave this alone and then make it larger here. And I didn't feel confident enough to do that. So the next thing I thought was, well, you know what? This is probably actually just an A-line skirt that's had an extra side sweep put on. So let's see what happens if I cut off that side sweep and stick it back where it came from. And this is why we needed to put both pattern pieces, because this piece here gets attached to this piece here, and this piece here gets attached to this piece here. Bear with me. I'm probably making this way more complicated than it needs to be, but this is the way that intuitively made sense to me. So I've actually numbered them as well, 1 and 2. So I'm going to put 1 to the side, and I'm going to put 2 to the side, and then I'm going to bring this back over. So I'm going to need a spare piece of paper. We've got the top of the skirt here, and then this is the flare from the other side. So what I did was I brought it in and I overlapped the seam allowances and matched up the hem, and then kind of just worked out, tacked that down, and then worked out what this gap was here. And I added on, or drew on, like the extra line of the piece that I was missing, so that it was this is how much I wanted to extend this piece, because that's how long this seam needs to be. So I'm going to tape this down and just extend add on the extra length that I needed. So we're going to tape that down. And then I need to do exactly the same for the other piece. So this is the extra length that I needed, but added on in the middle of the skirt rather than at the hem of the skirt. So I need to do exactly the same for the second piece. So again, overlap the seam allowances, match up the hemline, make sure that I've got enough paper. Overlap the seam allowances, match up the hemline down the bottom there. And then draw on, if you're struggling with this, obviously tape it down, and then draw on that little bit extra that we need to add to get it to be the right extra amount. I hope this is making sense. It kind of, like I say, it was intuitive for me. It was just kind of like playing around and seeing what happened. Okay, and just fill in that hemline there. So now we have our random looking pattern pieces, and we want to stick them back together. So I'm going to take the flare from piece 2 and the body of piece 2, and this is number 1. We want to stick these back together along that edge there, and we're butting it up because we didn't add any seam allowance in there. So we just need to draw in the seam allowance again to get the correct pivot point. I'm going to do the same with this piece. So again, just drawing my seam allowance to get my pivot point back. And then we're going to walk the seams because we've also added a little bit of length to this one, and this one needs to fit into this one here. We've now got the added flare in the hip, and we've lengthened this piece, but we've also lengthened the piece that it corresponds with. So if we line these ones up with the notches and the seam allowances and then pivot there, this is now the right length, but then this piece has shortened a little bit, so we need to add just a touch to the corner of the skirt. So I'm matching up this pivot point with this pivot point to make sure that I'm adding the right amount. So just a little bit up there and curve that back into the waistline. And again, we're going to need to do exactly the same to the other pattern piece. So adding in, and again, this is obviously a miniature and it's not really to scale, so I'm kind of showing you the idea. So we've ended up with two pattern pieces that look like this. The last thing you want to do is draw in the seam allowance around the waist and measure to make sure that you haven't altered that at all. If you have, I would just angle this in so that the waist measurement stayed the same. But now, technically, you have added width in at the hips. I measured and it did actually fit me. The waist should have stayed the same, then the skirt pieces should still fit together. So again, we've got notches number 2 there, which match up with notches number 2 there, and then the pivot point matches up, and if you pivot it round, you've still got the waistline matching up as well. I really hope that made sense. It was the way that made sense to me. Like I say, I was doing this intuitively. I haven't changed the shape of the pattern pieces that much. They're sort of similar. There's just that extra room at the hips that I needed. So next step, sewing. Well, cutting out, then sewing. I felt confident enough to cut it out of fabric, not even calico, actual fabric. I was going to power ahead and do the brielle wool, but something stopped me. That little voice of reason in the back of my head that I sometimes listen to saying, make a muslin, wearable muslin, do it, do it. So I did it. I cut into this turquoise needle cord that I had bought many years ago from a knitting and stitching show. I love this colour, I love this fabric. I don't really like sewing with solids, as you guys know, so it was one of those ones that it wasn't inexpensive, but it wasn't the most expensive fabric I owned. Brielle wool, I'm looking at you. So I decided to risk it and give it a try and cut into it. Because of the grain line on the pattern pieces, which is straight up and down this point, so this is the waist, the grain line is straight up and down here. I knew that cutting out needle cord was going to be interesting because needle cord obviously has a nap. I thought it would add a layer of interest to this pattern, especially because of the interesting seaming details on it. I was right, it definitely did. I think in the plain fabric it's made it more obvious where the seam lines are, and it's given an added layer of interest. So using needle cord was something that I did consciously decide to do for specific reasons, and I really like how it's turned out. Sewing the skirt is really, really easy. As I mentioned, these skirt pieces have notches on them, so this notch here is number 2, and then this notch over here is number 2, so you know that those two notches go together. The only difficult part of sewing this skirt together was making sure that the pivot points were hit nicely and came out neatly. My trick for doing that neatly is to pin one side, sew up to the pivot point, backstitch, take the work out from under the machine, readjust everything, and then sew the final seam. Don't try and leave your needle down and readjust the fabric whilst you're sewing. I find that ends up with tucks and puckers in those little corner points, and it's not my favourite method. They've usually been reinforced and clipped into as well, so a little bit of extra back stitching in that area doesn't hurt, in my opinion, to reinforce what is a weak point on your skirt. So I wanted to show you my method for doing these corners where you have to reinforce the corner. Obviously don't use a biro, use something that will come away with either heat or like chalk or something like that that works with your fabric that you're using. So first up we have this one. Now we need to reinforce this corner, so I like to draw in the lines that I need to reinforce, and usually about an inch either side of the point that I need to reinforce, because this is the point here. So I also like to draw in the seam allowance on the piece that I will be sewing into that point. For this purposes, I'm working with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So the idea is that we're trying to get this point and this point to match up. So the first thing that I'm going to do is reinforce this line that I've just drawn. I won't backstitch at the beginning or the end, but I will slightly reduce my stitch length just to add a little bit of extra reinforcement in this area. Okay, so I'm going to trim off the excess thread. And like I say, I haven't backstitched. And obviously, again, you'll be doing this in a thread that matched the project that you're working on. But again, we're doing a demonstration. I think this is the first time I've ever done a demonstration like this. So the next thing you want to do is you want to clip up to, but not through that stitching, to the corner. So to the point that we're sewing to. And the closer you can get, the neater you're going to end up with your sewing being. So now that we've clipped that, it's basically, this is what we're trying to achieve, that we're sewing in a straight line, as it were. So we now need to pin our piece that we're sewing to this piece together. I'll put my pin through the point that I'm trying to sew it to, and I'll put the pin through the bit that we've just reinforced, and then make sure that that is all lining up nicely, and then I will pin the rest of the seam in place so the raw edges are matching up. That's all I'm going to try and do. Now, a lot of different patterns will have you try and then maneuver everything around and pin the other side of this piece in as well, and I just find that really fiddly, and I end up with puckers and lumps in mine, and I don't want that. So I'm going to backstitch at the beginning of the seam and stitch up to the point, make sure that I hit the point exactly, so go slow, and I'm going to backstitch there and break my stitching and take the work out from under the machine. So let me see if I can get you a little bit closer so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Hopefully that's better. So yeah, I'm gonna start sewing my seam at 5/8 of an inch, backstitch. I've got my stitch back to a regular length stitch now, taking my pins out as I go and just being careful to sew up to the dot but not past it, taking the pin out at the last second, and then I'm going to backstitch. So I've reinforced that area. So I'm going to trim off my threads, getting it into shot. So you can see there I've sewn over the reinforcing stitching that we did earlier, and I've stopped at that point there, and there you can see it on the other side. So now what you want to do is you want to pin in the other side. So you're going to turn it and you'll end up with this excess flap of fabric back here. So you want to turn it, and again you're going to match up the raw edges, and you want to put a pin through the point that we're trying to match up and make sure that it's coming out in the right place on the other side. So that hasn't come out at the right place. I'm going to take that back out. This is why I don't like doing it under the machine, because you can end up with that little tuck in there, and it's really not a good look. I mean, you can usually get away with it with a bit of pressing. There we go, that's better. So I've got my pin going through both points, and I'm now going to pin the rest of the seam that we're going to sew in place. Now, you can either start from this side, or you can go to flip the work over and start from the other side. I do sometimes like to do that because with that line of reinforcing stitching there, that gives you a guide of what you're aiming for. So I am going to sew with the reinforcing stitching side up, and I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch again. Okay, so I'm going to backstitch at the start and at the end again. So 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So when you start getting towards the line of reinforcing stitches, you just want to be aware of the fullness under here. So I've just kind of like moved it out of the way because I don't want to catch any of that. And I've still got the pin in, but I've kind of pulled it out just a little bit, which I'm sorry you can't see. It's not the greatest angle. I'm trying. So just go slowly, take the pin out when you get really close, and make sure once you hit that spot that you backstitch. And it doesn't matter if you go over slightly on this side. So it's going to end up looking like that. And from the right side, you've made a nice right angle. So again, I'm going to trim off the threads. And I haven't pressed anything yet, but if you open it all out, you can see without even pressing that we've sewn a really nice neat right angle corner, and so we want to go and press this so that everything lies nice and flatly. I like to press the seam allowances open. You will end up with like a kind of excess piece here which you can trim off. That's why I like to do it in 2 passes rather than 1, because it gives me the neatest results and the most control, I feel. This is what it looks like when it's pressed. I've just trimmed a little bit of the seam allowance off there, and that's the right side. Definitely the easiest way that I've found of sewing this kind of seam. The actual instructions for the skirt are brief. There are 5 paragraphs. It is actually very, very simple to get the skirt sewn together if you follow the notches as they are numbered. So that is an important marking to transfer over to your fabric as you are going. Ask me how I know. The construction of this went together very, very smoothly. I finished all the inside edges with bias binding. I am just not a fan of using my overlocker on woven garments. That's not because there's anything wrong with it, it's just because I was scared of my overlocker for a good 5 years and had to work out different finishing techniques. So now I love bias binding and French seams for woven garments. It's just my preference. I don't love the inside of this skirt, but I knew I wasn't going to. So I cut out a viscose acetate lining using the Butterick 6380 skirt pieces, because that's a very small, non-flared A-line skirt that I know fits me. I cut that out and sewed it together and added it into the skirt for 2 reasons. One was to help hide the insides, and the second one was so that I could wear this skirt over tights and layering pieces. I know Needlecord can get very sticky and clingy without a slippery lining on the inside, and I knew that I was going to be wanting to wear this skirt with tights, so a slippery lining was going to be essential. As I say, it also hides all the insides. I am going to show you a close-up of those now, because I know you guys like to see the inside of my garments. All finished with bias binding, but as you can see, you have to clip into this edge, and yeah, not a fan. Yeah, those 90-degree clip into angles are never my favourite, and I don't know of a good way of finishing them neatly. I can't flat fell the seams, at least the back seam or the seam where the zipper goes in, because the zipper has to go in, so it needs to be pressed flat and finished flatly on each side. So it's not my favourite finish on the inside of this garment. So once I'd bound all the seams, hemmed everything, sewed it together, put the hook and eye in, I tried it on and I didn't like it. It does fit beautifully over the hips, so at least all the hard work with the pattern has paid off, but it's still too big at the waist. And realistically, I don't think that I will be able to tweak this without putting in darts to make this fit better, because I have such a large difference between my hips and my waist. That's just something that I have found with most fitted skirts over my hips, is that there needs to be room to take in that excess fabric and have it still look smooth. So I think darts would be the way forward. I would put 2 darts in the front and two darts in the back to spread that extra fullness, so I could nip the waist into the measurement that I would like it to be. I tried it on with the Peeps, and a few of us came up with the idea of turning it 90 degrees and making it a side zip rather than a back zip, and the difference is amazing. Oh my goodness. Just turning the skirt 90 degrees has saved it, in my opinion. I love it now. I really, really love it. Not so much that I'm going to make it again because of the insides and the fitting at the waist. Well, not for a little while. I have an idea. But I will wear this particular skirt with the outfit that I have on today, or variations of. I had enough of the Needlecord to cut out this waistcoat, and I knew that it would look really good with the skirt. So I'm very pleased that I've managed to tweak the skirt so that it works for me and is something that I actually would feel comfortable wearing. The centre back and the centre front seam, the volume coming from basically the crotch and the butt, just not for me. I like it in the sides. I think the flare in the sides looks awesome. I think when it comes from the crotch and the butt, it looks weird. I also think, having turned it 90 degrees, that the sweep of the seams is more obvious. I don't know, I just prefer it. I just prefer it, and it's gone from something that I was 100% going to sell to something that is 100% going to live in my wardrobe and actually get worn. So, you Patreon peeps that voted for this skirt, thank you. I think. It's been an interesting adventure. I'm glad that I've tried it. I do like the finished skirt. I'm not going to use it to make up my Brielle wool. My inspiration picture had the skirt has a lot more volume in it, and I think the 3/4 circle skirt that I know and love is going to give me the silhouette that I want. This one is interesting. I'm glad I've tried it. Thank you very much to Maggie for sending me this pattern. It has been an interesting experiment, that is for sure. Once I've drafted my pencil skirt block, I actually want to revisit this pattern because I think that altering a block that I know fits me perfectly is going to be so much easier than trying to retro engineer a pattern that really hasn't ended up fitting me as well as I would like it to. So I'm not ruling out trying this skirt again in the future, even with those 90-degree angles that I don't like. If you have a great finishing technique for those, let me know in the comments down below because they bug me. But yeah, I think I will try this again once I've drafted my block so that I can make it from my measurements and have it fit me perfectly rather than trying to retro engineer a vintage pattern. If you enjoyed seeing me puzzled and working through problems, you might enjoy this video here. Mistakes were definitely made.